Okay, so welcome to our session today on the imposter syndrome. Really pleased you could join us for the session live. And just to say, this session will be recorded afterwards, so it will appear on our YouTube channel, just in case you want to go back and listen to any other elements or any phases of the conversation. I'll do some housekeeping in a moment, but just to introduce Helen and Veronica, I'm really pleased they could join us for this session today. Helen, some of you may recognize, last year Helen and I did a webinar on taking the lead on leave. Helen's an executive coach. She's also the founder of Tool Wall, which is an executive coaching company. And they specialize in working with female leaders and also high potential women, mainly in the professional services and large corporations. So welcome, Helen.
Thank you.
And also Veronica Azua. So Veronica is an organizational psychologist and coach who's been working globally in leadership development for the past decade, working in professional services firms such as Deloitte and KPMG, in industry with organizations like Burberry, and also academia, so the London Business School. So Veronica is currently studying a doctorate researching self-doubt and its impact on leaders. So my intention really, sorry Veronica, so welcome first before I get carried away. And my intention really of bringing Veronica and Helen together for the session today was both their mix really, both from academia but also the pragmatic experiences of coaching and supporting leaders around this topic. So in terms of the session, just a bit of housekeeping. You all are on mute, so please feel free to add any questions or comments on the chat panel as we're going through the session today, and I'll be bringing some of your questions into the conversation I'll have with Veronica and Helen. I would really encourage you to close down any other applications on your web browser, email, etc. And the reason I'm suggesting that is not to ensure you're listening to the wealth of information that you're going to be getting this morning, but also just to ensure it's not affecting any transmission speeds. So sometimes it may impact on that. Other than that, really, I'd just always encourage you to have a pen and paper handy. Just in terms of the content, you're here for a reason, so just to make sure that you can get the most from the session. We're not going to be showing any slides, it's purely going to be a conversation. So in terms of the session, I have sort of thought about some questions that I would like to cover with Veronica and Helen in terms of their experiences. So we are going to, of course, start to look at what and define imposter syndrome and put it in its context. I think we're then going to sort of hear from Veronica and Helen about their experiences, and then start to think about the so what. So how might we support ourselves, but also how might we support our coaching clients as well. So that's a broad level in terms of the frame that we're going to be covering over the next hour or so. But I'm a coach, so really want to start with an outcome. So please feel free now just to add any questions to the chat panel that you would like to cover in terms of making this a worthwhile session for you, and you hearing the information that you would like to hear around this topic. So I'm just going to give you a moment or two just to add any questions into the chat panel. I can see there a point from Helen about wider reading, which we can touch on later. So just feel free to add any other questions to the chat panel just while we're waiting. This is such an important topic. It features in the coach training course that I run because it's something that we often meet in the chair sitting opposite ourselves. I also think for coaches, often, if we're sitting down with perhaps a chief exec for the first time of global business, sometimes we're connecting with that for ourselves as well. So I think this is much about us as it is about the people that we're working with. And I always would encourage coaches to do the work on themselves around an area before supporting others. So we can see some points coming through now, which is fantastic. So yeah. So Kimberly's asking about what strategies from Robert. Yeah, so he's got particular interest in supporting clients to bring about the realization this is happening for them. Amanda, some techniques to support coachees in resetting to a more productive mindset. Thea, techniques in the moment to self-coach when you're feeling imposter syndrome loom. Thanks, Thea. Yeah, so some questions starting to come through. So please, please feel free to continue to add to those as we're working through the session this morning. If it's okay, let's start just with a broad question. And Veronica, perhaps I'll come to you first, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure.
That, you know, the term imposter syndrome has been getting a lot of press, you know, and it's something that's spoken about quite a bit now, and often coachees may be saying, "Oh, I think I'm experiencing imposter syndrome," but you know, how do you define it?
Hi. Yeah. Well, hello and welcome to all. And yeah, it's actually, you know, the term has been around for a while. It's been defined in the 70s by two psychologists in the US, and they define it as the experience of intellectual phoniness. So feeling intellectually a fraud and not being able to nourish yourself to take in the achievements. So not being able to internalize the success and the achievements. And initially, the research in the 70s was specifically around women in academic environment, which makes sense. You know, academics are all, you know, the logic, the knowledge and the logic, and it's all up here. But actually, rest assured that over the decades, the research suggests that it's not only women and it's not only in the academic environment, that we are all affected by it. And, you know, we were chatting just before that 70% of us at some point in our life or career will be affected by imposter syndrome. And actually, depending on what kind of research you look at and what kind of data you cut, the number goes to 78 or 79. For example, for people who are finishing, for students who are finishing an undergraduate or postgraduate, when they are transitioning from studying to working life, that goes to 79. So I think the message is we're not immune, we're all affected somehow by it. So it's almost part of human nature. And I would say that imposter syndrome arguably is the consequence of something deeper going on. And this is a bit more the focus of my research. If you dig deeper behind the imposter syndrome, arguably you find self-criticism, self-doubt, and what we call in psychology and coaching, the inner critic, which is defined as this nagging, internal, impersonal voice that is creeping in all the time and criticizing us, attacking us, being cruel towards us, sabotaging. So it just arguably, yeah, the imposter syndrome is a consequence of also many decades ago, and it's all connected somehow.
Yeah, no, fantastic. Thank you. Thank you. And Helen, I'll just come to you just from your experiences, because, you know, when I look at the tall wall and obviously I suppose in the context I know you're working in, where there'd be a lot of high achievers. Yeah, just anything you want to add to this about your experiences?
And those statistics that Veronica mentioned are really interesting, because I read an article only last week about imposter syndrome, and they asked a question, you know, how do you spot that someone has imposter syndrome? And the answer was, well, just check to see if they've got a pulse, because everyone has imposter syndrome at some point. So those statistics, you could look at them in all different sorts of ways. But when I'm coaching, the things that clients say to me that make me think about the imposter phenomenon is usually things like, people don't know what I have to do to get this job done, and the mistakes that I make, and the struggle that I go through to do my work. Also sense that I've got to stage through luck, or there's been a mistake made. Often I'm coaching partner candidates and they've been tapped on the shoulder and told, you know what, we think you are partner material. Come through the process, you know, off you go. And often that really gives rise to this feeling of I'm not good enough and no one has worked that out yet, but I am going to be tapped on the shoulder for a different reason soon. I'm going to be told that they have found out that I don't really know what I'm doing. And, you know, that sense that I'm going to be found out and I feel a bit of a fraud. That's typically the sort of things that I hear that make me think of the imposter syndrome.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm building on that, Helen. That we work together on this, and we coach the people who are on the journey to partner. Many of them, they come out of the panel to become partners, saying, "I tricked them, I fooled them somehow. You know, it was my charm." Or and if you actually think about it, how illogical is that? How it's just helping them to become aware of how illogical is that you just got to panel or to partner just because you were charming. Yeah, how nice that.
And one last point on that, I work a lot in law firms, and people that I coach will tell me that you know, the 4 or 5 people that are helping them through the process to become a partner, you know, these lawyers who are some of the best lawyers in the country, somehow they have fooled all these people. So I will replay back to them. So what you're telling me is 4 or 5 lawyers, some of the best lawyers in the country, and lawyers are very analytical, you know, it's hard to pull the wool over their eyes. You have somehow managed to fool them. Is that right? Can that be right? Yeah, so I can say more about this, but I'm so interested that you know, this sense that we fooled people, and how logical really is that?
Yeah, and I mean, it takes me back to an experience I had in an organisation, and I was mentioning this earlier to you before we started, where, you know, we would take people from a certain level of leadership, you know, and they would go through various fast track programs that would move them up to direct to executive level very quickly. And actually what we were seeing consistently, you know, probably with 90% of the cohorts coming through, you know, the self-doubts, Veronica, and, you know, the inner critic, and certain things were coming through in the coaching process that started to make us question, you know, how were we as an organization really supporting these leaders to be successful in their new roles, actually, because it wasn't something that we spoke about back then. And I suppose consistently in my own coaching practice, I'd say, you know, it doesn't matter what position the leader is in, and obviously recently there's been a lot of famous people talking about the imposter syndrome, that this is something that they experience and they connect to. So what would you say you've learned about this? So, you know, thinking about your experiences or your research, Veronica, I mean, what would you say has been key for you?
So I think the topic is hugely rich, and some of the things I learned are to do with the impact. Also, how, you know, was the consequence of having such a strong inner critic, or a moment in our life or career where the inner critic is particularly dominant. And I usually mention 3 things that are that I notice more in my practice as a coach, and in leadership development, in the leadership development programs. So one of the key impacts is the sense of self-worth. I'm sure it's not going to be a surprise that if we are very critical to ourselves, if we have this nagging voice criticizing us, that our sense of self-worth is going down. So we feel we are not competent, we are not adding value. For example, in client meetings or in different projects, we are not adding value. So we appraise ourselves in a very negative way. And what I've been seeing is that as our sense of self-worth is low, we try to compensate. So I'm going to work harder. I'm going to work longer hours. I'm going to take on yet another piece of work, or another project, or manage more. And we know that the consequence of that is burnout and stress. So it's self-worth, trying to compensate by working more, and then we end up burning out. And actually, there is a Professor Laura Emson, who specializes in professional services firms. She talks about insecure overachievers as the key characteristic of these senior partners. That the culture of the organization is working long hours, but somehow they're compensating for their own insecurities. So that's the first point is self-worth. The second point is the capacity of processing information is affected. There's a lot of research on this. We filter information because we appraise ourselves negatively. We look at the typical example is the feedback, right? We get positive feedback and negative feedback, and we only listen to the negative. I did really well in the exams at university, but it must be because the rest of the students were poor, right? Where the academic level was poor. And it's the inability to take on the success, as we were saying earlier. Some research, particularly in psychotherapy, call this cognitive distortion. That's quite serious, isn't it? Cognitively not being able to see was there, right? Or being able to see, but with filters. So that's the second point. And the third point that I noticed that is key in this is the way we relate to others. So obviously I have my mind at work now, but could go beyond work. But the way we relate to others, if we are feeling our sense of self-worth is low, we are not feeling competent, we are doubting ourselves, we tend to seek validation outside. And that's quite dangerous because it puts us in a very vulnerable position. They say we kind of regress. We are like a child, like in a childlike position. And sometimes we enter meetings feeling like a 12-year-old rather than like a 40 years old. And that's quite detrimental. So what we're saying here is that the inner critic is sabotaging the possibility of having an equal relationship, a peer-to-peer relationship, regardless of how senior is the other person or the client and so on. And that is, we are relating towards each other all the time. So that's quite important to pay attention to. So those are the key things, the three things that I usually, I see it in the practice and I see it in the research.
Yeah, no, great. And we'll talk about what we might do with coaching clients or for ourselves. But again, some really nice, I suppose, prompts there. So self-worth, my paraphrase, how we're seeing the world in terms of the information that we're therefore taking in. And then that whole piece of external validation, especially when for a lot of leaders, they just simply won't get that anymore because, they're in that certain position. So again, just thinking about how this has a cumulative effect on them and potentially their performance,
Yeah, and I would say that there is nothing wrong. I mean, it's good to have feedback and it's good to have validation and encouragement from other people. But relying only on that, I think that's dangerous territory. We need to be able to develop a good sense of self within ourselves rather than only depending on the outside world.
Definitely. But again, when you're working with these insecure high achievers and the next thing, if they're not slowing down to actually make sense of what they're achieving, that self-worth will not be building in the same way. How about you, Helen?
I love the concept of the child and how we sort of go back to a almost childlike state. It makes me think of a client who is a lawyer and she's an expat, so she's British, but she heads up another part of the organization, another country, in fact, another country office. And she told me how she would come back to the London office and always feel like an imposter because people in London, even though this was the office she used to work in, must be doing things so much better than she would be. London is sort of quite kind of starry-eyed that somehow these were the adults in the organization and they would be doing things far more advanced than she was doing because she was off in a different geography. And I suppose picking up on your point as well, Damion, sometimes in the organizations that I work with, the environment is such that it's extremely high performing. This is often up or out culture. And lots of professional service firms are getting much better at this, but there is still a sense that if I am not progressing, if I am not being promoted, I am not as good as everyone else. And sometimes coupled with that, I see in my practice is this inner sense of perfectionism. So you have an external voice saying you must progress, and you have an internal voice saying you can do better than that, you have to be able to do better than this, it's not good enough. And both those things come together, and that's when the imposter syndrome shows up. So people I'm coaching are often comparing their inner with everyone else's outer, and doesn't everyone else look like they have got it together? And I haven't. And I think certainly the work I do, it's most apparent in this high performing environment, which is relentless. And you are always made to feel, to some extent, that what you've done could be better. And if you don't have that inner voice to be able to say to yourself, do you know what I did was good enough there. And next time I can learn something and I might do it differently. But for now, that was enough. You don't have that, then that's when the imposter syndrome can run away with you.
Yeah, great.
And, I was going to say that, building on what Helen said, that it's just spot on, Helen. I totally relate to what you say. And particularly when you mention perfectionism, because this group of clients would say, oh no, but I want to, there's nothing wrong with being perfectionist. They want to achieve. And I usually say there is nothing wrong with being a perfectionist. And actually there is a lot of research on perfectionism. However, the research differentiate two types of perfectionism: the maladaptive perfectionism and the perfectionism. And the maladaptive one is the one when we are getting caught up in perfecting the impossible, when we are not able to stop and breathe in the achievements and taking what went well, celebrate. And the difference with the perfectionist or the well-adapted perfectionist is that they work hard, but they know when good enough is good enough. They are able to recognize when they need to stop, and they are able to nourish themselves from and celebrate the achievements. So nothing wrong with perfect. If somebody wants to argue, oh no, because nothing wrong with perfectionism.
And that goes, the imposter syndrome is often a double-edged sword for many people. This voice in the head saying you could do more is the thing that drives them on to do better and better. And that's a great thing. It does propel people to do the very best they can, but there's a line, isn't there, where you cross over and that no longer becomes helpful, and it becomes an interference to your potential rather than feeding your potential and helping you reach it. I think knowing where that line is really important.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and that whole change when so I like to use the phrase, it has you rather than you having it, meaning you're just completely identified and overwhelmed with this well, you're like the childlike part of you, so one of the questions I did have, which I thought was interesting, was by an executive coach. She couldn't attend today, but she asked me to ask you this question, and she wanted to know, based on an experience she'd had recently with a client, her question was, does your imposter syndrome sort of follow you around? So, is it environmental or context specific, or does it just follow you wherever you go? So, I just wondered if you had any thoughts on
that. No, go ahead, Helen. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think a lot of the people that I'm coaching are suddenly feel exposed. So some things happened that has given rise to this imposter syndrome. They have an underlying feeling that they're not good enough, but something has happened. Usually they've been tapped on the shoulder and said, we think you should be a partner in this firm, or we want you to take on this new role in this organization. And that is the point where that transition is the point where people feel, my God, I thought I was managing this to this point, I was okay to this point. Similarly, when women are coming back from maternity leave, which is another area I work in a lot in my practice, those people feel because they've had a long period of time off, they haven't been able to keep on top of things in the way they would have, if they hadn't have had a year or so off for mat leave, and therefore they're going to be exposed. So they've managed it to this point, they've kept a lid on it, but something usually triggers that means it's come out into the open, and now it's become a problem.
Yeah, absolutely. It's actually building on what you say, Helen. What I usually, so it's part of my research that I'm studying self-doubts in leadership at the point of transition, because I notice exactly what you're describing. So over a decade of working with leaders, whether in leadership development or coaching, the one thing I noticed was the self-doubts, but not the self-doubts isolated, but at the point of transition. For example, when they are on the partner track, about to become partners, or after becoming a partner, finally I got to where I wanted, and now what? Like and then, or maybe taking a big role, or moving organization, or so there must be a change or a transition that triggers the self-doubts. Maybe the self-doubts were dormant, were sleeping there, and the change had wakened them up. And outside work as well, like becoming a parent, arguably also can trigger, am I a good enough mother or no? So definitely connection with transition.
Yeah, great, thank you. And just anything else you want to share around that question, around what's the sort of key learning you've had, or anything else that just feels important about this topic, just before we start to transition into thinking about the so what, how might we work with it?
I would say that it's relentless. That is the one characteristic that I see. It comes back. The imposter syndrome and the self-doubt, it comes back. So we need to be aware of that. It's not going to go away, basically. We can manage it, but it's not going to go away. And it's okay. It's part of human nature, right? So, but it's relentless.
One of the questions on the panel I can see is it normal to feel like this, and should we be at peace with it and not see it as bad? And I think that, Veronica, you've almost answered that question. It's there, and if it's there, work with it, use it to propel you, but don't let it limit. If you think about the equation of performance equals potential minus interference, notice when it becomes interference, and I know we'll come on to Damion about what you can do about it, but notice when is it interfering with my potential. Because you're right, I totally agree, Veronica, it's absolutely it can be pervasive and relentless. So really it's about managing it.
And that's such an important part you both raised, just in terms of helping the client. So I use the word accept it, accept it's there, and see the positives it brings and what they would lose if it wasn't there, but also, like we've spoken about, when it becomes unhelpful. But the key thing is the acceptance that sits around that. And if acceptance is too much, maybe just tolerate, Okay, so I'm just going to pause just for a moment and just see, just before we move on and talk a bit about how we might work with this, just again, if there are any other questions that have just arisen whilst we've been talking so far, just about the context and what we may be meeting, and perhaps what's sitting beneath that, as Veronica was saying, in terms of that sort of self-doubt. Just any other questions that have emerged so far? I can see there's a lot of points in there around what we might do, which we're going to come on to next, but just if there are any other questions. Okay. So if there are, just feel free to put those onto the chat panel. So I've just seen from Helen, she's just saying, in terms of, are there any underlying factors? I mean, you've sort of spoken about, the self-doubt, Veronica, but just any other underlying factors that you sort of see? We've spoken a bit about transition as well, or perhaps there's been a change.
Well, in my workshops and in the sessions that we do for larger audiences as well, I usually talk briefly about the origins of the inner critic. And I think we need to do a whole new seminar about it. But just briefly, I'm sure it's not going to be a surprise. It has to do with your upbringing and the early years of your childhood. And so typically is the quality of the relation between the main caregiver, the parent, and the child. And, you know, and the quality of that relationship and how we interjected the authority figures as we were growing up. And when I say authority figures, it could be our parents, the main caregivers, an uncle, an older brother or sister, or somebody who represented authority, maybe a teacher. And so the interactions and how we interjected that authority would somehow define the qualities. There are other facts about that specifically will define the quality and the intensity of the inner critic and the self-doubts. That's, yeah.
Yeah, great. Thank you. So I could just see some other questions coming through. Amanda's just asked if imposter syndrome is more relevant in certain cultures. So, you know, the whole sort of inner critic piece, I know in the West, in Western cultures is more prevalent probably, you know, but you've mentioned, I suppose, organizational cultures such as high achievement cultures that drives this, but anything that came through around that, Veronica, just in terms of your research, have you seen anything?
I actually, to be honest, I didn't see anything cultural wise in the I haven't, in the literature review, I haven't seen anything. But in the practice, I think, well, as you can see, I'm not English, I'm not British. So I think the cultures that are more inclined and more open to express emotions and feelings, I would say, and again, please, this is just what I see in the practice, is not backed up by research, are more inclined to be exposed to share and be exposed to self-criticism and the criticism of others. And cultures who are a bit more reserved, I would say that they manage it a little bit better. They manage the inner critic a little bit better. And that leads me into the gender. I have a lot of questions around gender, whether is it only women or men? So as I said earlier in the research in the 70s, it was only in women. However, and now it's just men and women. However, in my research, I can see that women are much more inclined to put the hands up and say, I feel doubtful, I'm not sure about myself. And men are suffering imposter syndrome and self-doubt, but they are managing much, much better than us. The psychological component of men apparently made them well suited to manage and to defend against the self-doubts.
It makes me, I love the first part of Amanda's question when she says it's difficult when we live in the society we do, and the sort of gloss that everyone can put on their lives. You can put gloss on your lives now much more easy than ever before through social media. And it makes me think of the organizations that I work in. When you go into the reception of some of these organizations, they are built to intimidate. You know, they are made to look, they are so important, so glossy, so perfect. And it really makes me think, it's only just occurred to me, but in the old days when you sought permission to go to the palace and see the king or queen, you'd have to go through a number of rooms, all intended to make you feel so small and intimidate you and make you question whether what you needed to say was really valid and make you feel small. And somehow there's something about the organizations I work in, there's something about that environment and just simply the way it looks that I think can bring this out. I was coaching someone recently who was in a different office in the UK, and she had to come and do her partner panel in the London office, and there was something about this London office that was really getting in the way, because every time she came down she felt, God, this office is so intimidating. I don't belong here. I'm going to be judged by people who are here in this office and I don't belong here. So I think there is Amanda's point is a very valid one, that in today's society and in the organizations I see, there is something about the environment that also brings this up.
Yeah, great. And I've just seen a point from Kimberly, which I thought was quite interesting. Are there any circumstances when it works in someone's favour?
I think that's that double-edged sword. It can really drive people on. I'm going to do the best I can, and it's never good enough. It's never enough. So I'm going to keep going and going. I'm going to work harder and harder, and that's how, in these organizations, that's sometimes how these organizations work. Laura Empson in her book will talk about how she'll liken HR to drug dealers who will prey on the vulnerable. The people who will always push for more and more and more. They are never satisfied, and these are the sort of people that you can rely on time and time again to come up with the brilliant idea and deliver the brilliant thing. So I think in many ways it does propel people to do the very best they can. But again, it's knowing when you've taken that too far.
I think I totally agree with that. And the positive side, again, like this double edge of the inner critic, the positive side is that the same inner critic that at some point is holding us back will in other situations make us more courageous. It's courage, it takes a lot of courage and take risk to go for that promotion, to ask for the promotion, to ask for a pay rise, or to go for a new role and so on. It takes a lot of courage, and I think arguably behind that is the inner critic pushing us to you can do it, you can do better. So I totally see what you're saying, Helen. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And I and I think there's something here just around how can we work with this then? We're clearly saying that there's some benefits, if we do recognize this in ourselves, but also some challenges. So if someone is listening, let's put it external, if someone is listening to this and sort of noticing that this is something they recognize in themselves, what would you say is important for them to perhaps be aware of? Like if you were going to start to help them make sense of this, what would be your initial response to that? And perhaps Helen, perhaps I'll come to you this time. If that's okay.
I think the first step is to normalize what you're experiencing. When I'm coaching people, often they've never voiced their fears out loud, and I'll often say to clients, if you take nothing from this conversation except leave this room and know that 9 out of 10 people that you'll meet as soon as you walk out this door will experience the same concerns and fears and feelings of being an imposter as you are describing to me. No, you are not alone. So I think that is the first step to normalize it. And thankfully, we are now talking about this so much more. There is a feeling that even really accomplished famous people, leaders are opening up and saying that I've experienced this too. So I think that's the first thing, is to know that you are no different to anyone else. Showing as a coach, being able, we are always showing compassion to our clients and empathy. So doing that for yourself. So being able to regulate your self-talk, how is this helping me to tell myself that I'm not good enough and this is all going to go horribly wrong and they're going to find out that I don't know what I'm doing? How is that helping you? And I often, work a lot with parents, and I will often ask them, if you talk to your child the way you choose to talk to yourself, how will that child grow up? What are the traits we'll see in that child emerge as you constantly tell them they're not good enough? And that's sometimes quite a sort of awakening. Oh God, yes, if I were to talk to my children the way I talk to myself. So it's just noticing in yourself, when you allowing that voice to creep in, and how is it serving you? How could it possibly serve you to tell you this is all going to go horribly wrong as you walk into the room of a big meeting?
Yeah.
I mean, it might get you on your game and get the adrenaline going, but really, how is that really helping?
Yeah, and just totally building on that, Helen, something that in coaching we use a lot, which is self-awareness. So I think half of the battle is becoming aware of the signs when the inner critic is creeping in, helping the client recognize the signs. And I was thinking, there's a lot of research around the inner critic that says I have physical signs. Can you believe that? It puts us under so much pressure that there is a tense jaw, tense neck, a defensive position, and that is a result of the anxiety created by the inner critic that you're not good enough. And also other signs of recognizing it connected with the self-awareness is when we start sounding like a broken record. That's a sign that we come back to the same place of self-criticism and you're not good enough, and this repetitive and rigid thinking. Those are the signs that we need to be aware of and make the coachee aware of. And at the end of the day, what's self-awareness? Self-awareness gives us the choice, the conscious choice. Do we want to continue paying attention to the inner critical voice, or do we want to make the conscious decision of putting the attention somewhere else? And there is a lot that we can learn in this particular point, and the techniques around overcoming the inner critic from Buddhism, from Buddhist psychology. And I'm sure, Damion, this sounds very familiar to you with all the mindfulness that you do, that being able to make the conscious choice and say, I'm not going to listen to this anymore.
Yeah, and I think that's the key thing around awareness, isn't it? With awareness there comes choice. Because actually it may be supporting me, that sort of, if I've got, because I can just see there's a question from Pfizer, how do you differentiate when it's true? Example, if there are true knowledge gaps versus a harsh inner critic. And I think your bit about repetition, and if we're noticing we're saying the same things to ourselves, like you were saying, versus there's a reality in that when I actually look at other sources of data and information,
And we as coaches can do that for our coachees. So I have done this where we've done a really bespoke set of 360 feedback where the coachee has determined who I will speak to. They have determined the questions, that many of which they dare not ask themselves because they're frightened of what will be said. So they've determined the people, they've determined the questions. I go out and speak to those people in confidence and anonymize everything that's been said, so we get to the truth, or a truth, of what is happening here. Let's really understand, is there a gap in your knowledge and your expertise that you are fearful is going to get found out, or is it that this is a story you're telling yourself? And I think as coaches, one of those ways is to try and get to the facts and speak to the people who will have another take on this and bring all that together to share a sense of what is really going on here. And I found that to be really impactful with some people. I mean, it's hugely impactful if you choose the right people with the right questions.
And can I add to your point? You mentioned briefly, Helen, compassion. And so in coaching, we talk a lot about the positive intent in the session. As a coach, having a positive intent, and how important it is to help the coachee develop a positive intent towards themselves. So instead of developing an inner critic, developing an inner kind coach. And a lot of that can be bring in by self-compassion. And again, there's a lot of research around self-compassion and how self-compassion can lower the self-criticism. And a lot of this is taken from meditation or from mindfulness, and is defined in this context, self-compassion, as the ability to be warm to yourself, to be kind to yourself, or exactly what you were saying, Helen, earlier on, being kinder to yourself, treating yourself well, and the absence of self-judgment. And that brings warmth towards yourself and towards others, accepting yourself with the mistakes and the positive things.
And that's I love, the inner critic versus the inner coach, and that sub-personality work that we might do as coaches to, how loud is the volume turned up on the inner critic? And what if we turned up the volume on the inner coach just a couple of notches and really bringing to life the inner coach and what the inner coach would tell us, so that there is a fair balance between the parts of ourselves that we choose to listen to. You're hearing both sides. The inner critic is not going to go away, nor should it, because it serves us. But also there's this other part, this inner coach that has not been listened to and is not being allowed to have a voice. So let's turn that volume up and see what happens.
Yeah, no, wonderful. And even just like you're doing, just getting them to externalize it, write it down, the two voices, and then again there's a choice which one they can start to notice more of. I just I've seen a couple of other points come through, and I just wanted to pick up because I thought this may come to some of the work and the conversations you're having, Veronica. But from Pfizer said, if this phenomenon is affected by many, what would happen if partners, seniors discuss with others throughout the organisation? So perhaps putting on the agenda and having sort of conversations. I just wondered if you got any experience of that in terms of perhaps. I suppose it's more like action learning groups or other conversations that may be happening outside of coaching.
So I think I mentioned earlier that in terms of the leadership programs that we are designing, so I try to include not only one-to-one sessions, but group sessions. And when I say group sessions, not more than 8 people, where they can talk about this, where this can be, as Helen was saying earlier, be normalized. And hopefully they can bring that into their teams. Because some of the questions sometimes are, so what do I do when a member of my team is suffering from the imposter syndrome? So again, just being able to talk to others, whether it is in a group or with your staff or with a good colleague, somebody that you feel safe with. So being able to talk about it, which we've been discussing it, but I think the group, being able to discuss it in a group, bring a lot of richness and lowers, it's a sense of relief every time, the sense of relief. And being able to recognize how much, as the earlier questions about the environment, how much organizations are making the most of it. And it's not to criticize organizations, it's partly a percentage that belongs to the individual, but it's a percentage that belongs to society and belongs to the organization, and how much the organizational culture might be fueling the individuals in a critique, and being aware of it and being prepared to push back and say, actually, when we are being fueled and when we are when it's ourselves, where is the boundary?
Yeah, no, great.
I think it would be hugely powerful if partners and senior people in organizations did more to talk about it. And the workshop Veronica and I did recently, it was a conference space. There was a lot of people in the room. We got them all to share with the person next to them at a time when they felt the inner critic speak up. And what happened, and just that sense of all those people sharing just one occasion suddenly makes you feel less alone. And I think that's really key, is to normalize this and make people understand, help them understand that what you're feeling, you are not alone. And if I could reach into your head and take that out, imagine what you'd be capable of. Imagine what would be possible if I reached into your head and took away the part of the inner critic that is overwhelming and is really holding you back now. Imagine what you would be capable of. And I think the more leaders can talk about times when they have felt like an imposter, the more permission other people have to say, me too, to use that phrase.
Just, as I'm listening to you, Helen, how liberating it feels to ask yourself that question. How life will be without that overpowering inner critic, and just being able to set yourself free from it. Set yourself free from it. You have the power to do that, to set yourself free from the unhelpful part of the inner critic.
Yeah, and the normalization of that makes it more comfortable for me to be able to do that, doesn't it? You know, in terms of recognize it. It's a key thing. So I've seen an interesting point come through from Thea. She's saying, have you seen any powerful transference of learning on how to manage imposter syndrome well from male mentors to females? You said that generally men were better at managing imposter syndrome. So I just wondered if, you know, there has been any learning.
I saved that one for...
Yeah.
No, it's just the research is not conclusive yet. So I think it's going to be an incomplete answer, I think. But definitely it's part of my plan to see how men are dealing with it. What can we learn from them?
Yeah.
I've seen it done badly. You know, so men might say to a woman reporting into them, well, just get on and do it. I mean, you can do it. Of course you can do it. Go on. You know, totally believe in you. Off you go. And I don't think that really gets to the point of what's going on here, which is why the confidential space of a coaching environment is a place where you can really explore what is going on for that person.
Do you
but
know,
I agree. Sorry, go on, Veronica.
The only thing that I would say is that, in my experience, men are able to have a balanced view. We women are more radical. Oh, it's me. Like, I didn't win the pitch because it was me. When actually in the same situation, if you hear a man talking as, well, it might have been, the crisis, it might have been the environment, it might have been the team, they are able to spread the responsibility. And women, we take it. Yeah, it's all me. This is what I noticed.
I was talking to a chief exec recently who the vast majority of the people reporting into him are women, and he said, of the 8 women reporting into him, none of them questioned their pay rise or their bonus. They all were very grateful. Thank you thank you for giving me that raise and that bonus. The 2 men that reported into him both said, I don't think I'm getting enough and I want more. And they felt confident enough to be able to say, I am worth more. And these are the reasons why. And I thought that was very telling that the women did not do that, and yet men felt that they could, that they had the right to say that, and that they were absolutely correct in pushing. And I think that's a much bigger issue about gender equality, but there's something there about women feeling like they're more grateful for what they get, rather than pushing for anything more that they might deserve in terms of recognition.
So thank you, and that takes me thinking around the whole concept of emotional intelligence and what you often see playing out in senior leaders who are male, female, etc. So I'm just conscious of time, so I just wanted to if there's anything you haven't said so far that would be really useful for coaches or leaders who are listening, just in terms of thinking about how they may be supporting either themselves actually, but also others. If there's anything you haven't said so far that you would like to say before we bring this to a close.
I mean, I'm conscious of time, but working with strengths, working with your own strengths, but working with your coachees' strengths, helping them to see what they're saying through the eyes of an adult with wisdom and logic and experience. So using, the 3 chairs exercise, getting them to sit in the seat of their line manager and understand what's really going on, sit in the 3rd seat and see this story you're telling yourself. What is it? What's it all about? What do you notice as you see it playing out? Veronica mentioned about diffusion earlier, and that sense of being able to remove people from what's going on and see it with a different lens, with a different see it more objectively. And I think we can do that for ourselves as coaches, but we can also do that really powerfully for our coachees.
Thank you. How about you, Veronica?
I think it's more of a reminder of the double edge of the inner critic. It's not, it's so important to recognize how powerful it can be, and how it can be an amazing driving force that get us to where we are, or to successful positions in life. So try not to lose sight of that, and reminding them that they are managing their own thoughts and feelings. Well, at least we are supposed to tame and manage our own feelings and thoughts, and it's in their power to stop listening to the inner critic and start listening a bit more to the inner coach.
Thank you. And I think I just want to say that obviously to change a way of thinking, a habit, is going to take a lot of energy. And so I think this is where often as coaches we'll be working more holistically with that individual as well, making sure they are taking care of themselves. They are managing their energy, so that there's a lot more possibility for them to notice when they're caught in the pattern. I just think the other thing I just wanted to say is just, there was a question earlier about, do experienced coaches like us experience imposter syndrome? And I sort of think, it's often we'll be sitting in a chair with somebody, and if we have got a pattern, or there is that part of us that's not feeling, perhaps the inner critic's been kicking off, again, we're likely to experience that with the coachee in front of us. So I was just going to say as well, just really making sure that we go into the coaching session in a neutral space. If we have noticed that perhaps we're giving our power away to the coachee because they're a chief exec of a large business, and who am I to coach them? There's that thing around, how do I manage that for myself? So, I'm listening to my inner coach before I go into the session, rather than I'm going in quite a reactive state, because that would just be, I suppose, exacerbated, won't it? Yeah.
Absolutely.
So, I really just want to say thank you for your time and your wisdom and your input to the conversation. So yeah, really appreciate you making the time for this session today. Just for the people that are listening, just to say that our next session, our next webinar is on the 25th of May at 12 o'clock UK time, and that's going to be on reflective writing. It's a follow-up session to last year, because journaling is such a critical skill now, I'd say, for leaders and working with our coaching clients. But I'd actually say journaling is a fantastic intervention to support somebody to work with imposter syndrome as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so that's going to be our next session. So I really hope you can make that one. As I said earlier, this will be uploaded to our YouTube channel, so you can listen to this again. But just final questions, really. You've mentioned a couple of pieces of research. Just if there is any other reading you would recommend for people to dip into around this topic, what comes to mind?
I really like Laura Empson's Leading Professionals book. Veronica talked about it earlier. If you're working in a professional space or any kind of partnership, I think there's a brilliant chapter on imposter syndrome in there, and why imposter syndrome is so pervasive in these high-performing cultures. And I think that's great reading.
And also adding to that, there is a professor at INSEAD. Well, he has retired now. Manfred Kidivries. He's Dutch, but he's been working in INSEAD. It's a very difficult spelling. You probably need to send an email around with the spelling. But he talks a lot about the imposter syndrome, and very richly describe feeling like a fake and what to do about it. And it's definitely a must read.
Thank you. So we'll bring the session to a close. Thanks for dialing in. I hope you've taken a lot of value away from yourself and also your coaching practice, and look forward to connecting with you again soon. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.